The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the empty diner, each second feeling like a reminder of another penny lost. Maria wiped down the same table for what felt like the 100th time that day, her tired eyes scanning the rows of empty red vinyl booths. Outside, the small town of Millfield moved at its usual slow pace. But inside her family's diner, time seemed to stand still in the worst possible way. At 43 years old, Maria had never imagined her life would look like this. She inherited the diner from her father just 2 years ago, along with all the memories of busy Saturday mornings and the sound of sizzling bacon that once filled the air. Back then, the place buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the constant ding of the cash register. Now she was lucky if she served 10 customers on a good day. The morning rush, if you could even call it that, consisted of old Tom getting his black coffee and reading yesterday's newspaper for an hour, Mrs. Chen picking up a to-go order of scrambled eggs and maybe a traveling salesman stopping by for a quick bite. The lunch crowd had disappeared when the new fast food place opened on the highway, and dinner service barely existed anymore. Maria's daughter Lisa was starting her senior year of high school, and the guilt ate away at her daily. The girl needed new clothes, school supplies, and money for college applications, but Maria found herself counting quarters just to buy groceries. Last week, Lisa had quietly mentioned that her shoes had holes in them, but she said it didn't matter because nobody really notices anyway. Those words broke Maria's heart more than any overdue bill ever could. The stack of unopened envelopes on her desk told a story she didn't want to read. 3 months behind on rent. The electric company had already sent a warning notice. The food supplier was demanding payment before the next delivery, and somewhere in that pile was a letter from the bank that she was too scared to open, though she could guess what it said. Every morning, Maria would stand in front of the old cash register and do the same calculation in her head. If she could just get 30 customers a day, spending an average of $12 each, she might break even. But most days, she was lucky to see half that number, and her regular customers usually ordered the cheapest items on the menu. The diner itself was showing its age in ways that made her father spin in his grave. The coffee machine made strange gurgling sounds and sometimes refused to work entirely. 2 of the booth seats had tears in the vinyl that she'd tried to fix with duct tape. The freezer in the back had been acting up for months, and she lived in constant fear that it would die completely and ruin what little inventory she had left. But despite everything falling apart around her, Maria couldn't bring herself to give up. This place represented 3 generations of her family's dreams. Her grandfather had saved every penny from his factory job to open it in 1952. Her father had worked 16-hour days to keep it running and put Maria through college. The faded photographs on the walls showed decades of birthday parties, anniversary celebrations, and community gatherings that had made this little diner the heart of their neighborhood. The recipes were still the same ones her grandmother had written on, index cards now yellowed with age and splattered with decades of cooking. The pancakes were still fluffy and golden, the meatloaf still made with love and secret spices, and the apple pie still drew compliments from anyone brave enough to order dessert. But good food wasn't enough anymore when people could get a burger and fries for half the price down the road. Maria had tried everything she could think of to bring customers back. She'd started a lunch special for $5, even though it meant losing money on every plate. She'd created a loyalty card program that nobody seemed interested in using. She'd even tried social media, posting pictures of her daily specials on a Facebook page that had exactly 17 followers, most of them family members who lived too far away to visit. The loneliness was almost worse than the financial stress. Her husband had left 3 years ago, saying he couldn't handle the stress of a failing business and a wife who was married to a diner more than to him. He wasn't entirely wrong, but Maria couldn't abandon the legacy her family had built, even if it was slowly crumbling around her. During the long, quiet hours between the lunch and dinner rushes that no longer existed, Maria would sit in the back booth where her father used to count the daily receipts. She'd close her eyes and remember the sounds of a busy restaurant, orders being called out, plates clinking, children laughing while their parents enjoyed a night out. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else's life now, The hardest part was watching her neighbors drive past on their way to chain restaurants in the next town over. People she'd known for years, whose families had celebrated milestones, in these very booths now treated her diner like it was invisible. She understood their choices. Everyone was trying to stretch their dollars further these days, but it still stung. Last Tuesday, Maria had seriously considered throwing in the towel. She'd sat at her desk, staring at a calculator and a pile of bills, trying to figure out if she could afford to stay open another month. The numbers didn't add up no matter how many times she ran them. She'd even called a real estate agent to ask about selling the building, though the idea made her physically sick. But something kept her going. Maybe it was stubborn pride, or maybe it was the hope that things could turn around if she just held on a little longer. Every morning she'd unlock the front door, turn on the coffee machine and tell herself that today might be different. Today might be the day a bus full of tourists would get lost and discover her little diner. Today might be the day someone would taste her food and spread the word that this place was worth saving. The rain that had been threatening all afternoon finally started falling, drumming against the windows like tiny fingers tapping impatiently. Maria glanced at the clock and realized it was almost closing time on another disappointing day. She'd served exactly 6 customers and taken in $43, barely enough to cover the cost of keeping the lights on. As she prepared to flip the sign from open to closed, Maria caught her reflection in the glass door. She looked tired, older than her years, with worry lines that hadn't been there when she'd first taken over the business. But there was still fight left in her eyes, even if she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it burning. Tomorrow would bring another day of hoping for customers who might not come, another day of stretching every dollar until it screamed, and another day of wondering if she was foolish to keep believing that kindness and good food still mattered in a world that seemed to value speed and convenience over everything else. But tonight, she would go home to Lisa, help her with homework, and pretend that everything was going to be okay. Because sometimes pretending was the only way to make it through another day. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 hours, turning the quiet streets of Millfield into a mirror of gray clouds and dim streetlights. Maria was wiping down the coffee machine when she heard the familiar jingle of the front doorbell. She looked up at the clock and frowned. It was almost 8:30, and she'd been planning to close early again. Nobody came in this late anymore, especially not on a Tuesday night when the weather was this miserable. A man stood just inside the doorway, water dripping from his worn jacket onto the black and white checkered floor. He looked to be somewhere in his 60s, with silver hair that stuck out in wet clumps and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors. His clothes had seen better days, the kind of worn that comes from washing the same outfit too many times, not from fashion choices. He stood there for a moment, as if he wasn't sure he was welcome, his weathered hands fumbling with something in his pocket. When he finally looked up and met Maria's eyes, she saw something that made her chest tighten. It was the same look she sometimes caught in her own reflection lately. A mixture of pride fighting against desperation, hope wrestling with defeat. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice rough but polite. "I know it's getting late and I don't want to be any trouble." He pulled a crumpled dollar bill and some loose change from his pocket, counting it carefully in his palm like it was a precious treasure. "I was wondering, how much would just a cup of coffee cost? Maybe a piece of toast if you have any bread left." Maria watched him count and recount the coins, his fingers shaking slightly from either cold or hunger. Maybe both. She could see he had exactly $1.37, and he was trying to figure out if it was enough for the smallest meal possible. The sight reminded her of herself just that morning, counting quarters to see if she could afford Lisa's lunch money. Something twisted in her stomach as she realized this man was probably hungrier than she was, and that was saying something. His cheekbones were too sharp, his clothes hung loose on a frame that should have been bigger, and when he looked up at her with those tired eyes, she made a decision that surprised even her. "Coffee's free after 8 o'clock, she lied smoothly, walking around the counter to flip the lock on the front door. "And I've got some leftover dinner that's just going to go to waste if someone doesn't eat it." The man's face showed a mixture of relief and embarrassment. "That's very kind of you, but I don't want charity." I can pay for a cup of coffee at least. He held out his dollar and change, his pride evident in the way he straightened his shoulders despite everything. It's not charity, Maria said, guiding him to the cleanest booth by the window. It's business. I hate throwing away good food, and you'd be doing me a favor by eating it. She wasn't entirely lying. She did hate waste, though the truth was she rarely had leftovers these days because she cooked so little. She went back to the kitchen and started putting together a plate, her mind racing. She had enough ingredients for a decent meal, though it would mean she and Lisa would have to make do with cereal for dinner tomorrow. But looking at this stranger, she couldn't bring herself to care about tomorrow's problems when someone was hungry right in front of her. The meatloaf was still warm from the few lunch orders she'd served earlier. She added a generous helping of mashed potatoes, some green beans that were perfectly seasoned with her grandmother's secret blend of herbs, and a dinner roll that was soft and golden. Almost as an afterthought, she cut a slice of apple pie, the last piece from a pie she'd made hoping to sell but knowing she probably wouldn't. When she set the plate down in front of him, the man's eyes went wide. "Ma'am, this is too much. I can't possibly—" "The name's Maria," she interrupted, pouring him a steaming cup of coffee and refilling the sugar dispenser on his table. "And you can absolutely eat all of this. Consider it a welcome to Millfield." He introduced himself as Walter, and Maria could tell from his careful manners that he hadn't always been in this situation. The way he laid his napkin in his lap, how he waited until she sat down across from him before taking his first bite, the genuine gratitude in his voice when he complimented her cooking. These were habits formed in better times. As Walter ate, slowly, savoring each bite like it might be his last good meal for a while, they talked about small things. The weather, how long he'd been traveling, what brought him to their little town. He was careful not to reveal too much about himself, but Maria got the impression he was passing through on his way to somewhere else, though he seemed vague about where that might be. "This is the best meatloaf I've had in years," Walter said, and Maria could tell he meant it. "Reminds me of Sunday dinners when I was young. My grandmother used to make something similar, though I think yours might be even better." Maria felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. It had been so long since someone had genuinely praised her cooking, since someone had sat in one of her booths and looked like they were truly enjoying themselves. Even her regular customers ate quickly and left, treating the diner like a refueling station rather than a place to linger and enjoy a meal. When Walter finished eating, he tried again to pay for his meal, pulling out his small collection of bills and coins. "Please, let me give you something for all this. It's worth a lot more than what I have, but—" "You keep your money," Maria said firmly, starting to clear his plate. "Spend it on something you need more than a meal you've already eaten." But Walter was insistent, and finally Maria relented, allowing him to leave his dollar and change as a tip. It was more than she usually made in tips all day, and she knew he couldn't afford to give it away. But she also understood that sometimes letting someone pay what they can is more important than the money itself. As she walked him to the door, Walter paused and looked around the diner with the kind of attention she hadn't seen from a customer in months. His eyes took in the vintage photographs on the walls, the worn but clean booths, the way the warm light made everything feel cozy despite the rain outside. "You've got a special place here," he said thoughtfully. "The kind of restaurant that could be the heart of a community if people knew what they were missing." He paused at the door, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Sometimes the best things are hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right person to see their potential. Maria didn't quite know what to make of that comment, but something in his tone made her pay attention. Walter pulled his thin jacket tighter around himself and stepped back into the rain, disappearing into the darkness beyond the streetlights. As Maria locked the door behind him and started cleaning up, she found herself humming for the first time in weeks. She didn't know why, but feeding Walter had felt like the most important thing she'd done all day, maybe all month. There was something about the simple act of making sure another person didn't go hungry that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with cooking in the first place. She counted the day's earnings, $43 plus Walter's tip, and for once, the numbers didn't discourage her. Tomorrow was another day, and maybe it would bring more opportunities to remember that food was about more than money. It was about taking care of people, one meal at a time. 3 days had passed since Walter's visit, and Maria found herself looking toward the door more often than usual, hoping to see his familiar figure step inside from the rain. She'd thought about him several times, wondering if he'd found a warm place to sleep and enough to eat. There was something about their brief conversation that stuck with her, especially his comment about the diner's potential. Friday morning started like any other disappointing day. Maria was refilling the salt shakers when she heard someone knocking on the front door, even though the open sign was clearly visible. Through the glass, she could see a middle-aged woman in a dark coat, holding what looked like a briefcase. "Are you Maria?" the woman asked as soon as the door opened. "I'm Janet from the Millfield Community Center. I'm afraid I have some sad news about a gentleman named Walter." Maria's heart dropped into her stomach. "Is he okay?" Janet's expression was gentle but serious. "I'm sorry to tell you that Walter passed away in his sleep 2 nights ago. He'd been staying at our emergency shelter, and the staff found him peacefully in his bed yesterday morning." The news hit Maria harder than she expected. She'd only met Walter once, but somehow his death felt like losing an old friend. Maybe it was because he'd been one of the few people in recent months who had truly appreciated her cooking. Or maybe it was because she recognized something of herself in his quiet dignity. "The thing is," Janet continued, "Walter mentioned your diner to several people at the shelter. He talked about the kindness you showed him and how wonderful the food was. When we went through his belongings, we found something that we think belongs to you." Janet opened her briefcase and pulled out an old leather bag, worn smooth from years of handling. It was the kind of satchel that looked like it had traveled many miles and seen better days, but was clearly well cared for despite its age. "Walter left specific instructions that if anything happened to him, this should be brought to the kind lady at the diner who makes the best meatloaf in 3 states. Janet managed a small smile. "I think that means you." Maria's hands trembled as she accepted the bag. It was heavier than she expected, and she could feel the outline of papers and other objects inside. "I don't understand. Why would he leave me anything? I barely knew him." "Sometimes people recognize kindness when they see it," Janet said softly. "Walter may not have had much, but he was very specific about wanting you to have this. He said you would know what to do with it." After Janet left, Maria sat alone in the diner, staring at the leather bag on the table in front of her. Part of her felt like opening it would be invading Walter's privacy, but he had specifically wanted her to have it. With careful fingers, she unbuckled the worn straps and lifted the flap. The first thing she found was a small stack of photographs, old and slightly faded but well preserved. They showed a much younger Walter in a suit and hard hat, standing in front of various construction sites and buildings. In some pictures, he was shaking hands with other men in business attire, pointing at architectural drawings or posing with groups of workers. Underneath the photographs were newspaper clippings, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. As Maria read through them, her eyes grew wider with each article. Local architect wins state design award. Morrison building opens downtown. Franklin Morrison's latest project brings jobs to city. Franklin Morrison. Walter's real name was Franklin Morrison, and according to these articles, he had been a successful architect in Chicago throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The newspapers described him as innovative, creative, and dedicated to designing buildings that served communities rather than just looking impressive. But as Maria continued reading, the story took a darker turn. A more recent article from about 8 years ago carried the headline, "Prominent Architect's Family Killed in Accident." The piece described how Franklin Morrison's wife and teenage son had died in a car crash during a family vacation. The article mentioned that Morrison had been driving, though it wasn't his fault. Another driver had run a red light. Maria's hands shook as she read about how Franklin had blamed himself for the accident, how grief had consumed him, and how he'd eventually lost his business when he could no longer focus on work. The final article was from 6 years ago, simply titled, "Former Architect Missing Family Seeks Information." It mentioned that Franklin Morrison had disappeared from his Chicago apartment, leaving behind only debts and memories. Now Maria understood why Walter had seemed so familiar with good manners and quality. He'd lived a completely different life before tragedy struck, but there was more in the bag that would surprise her even further. At the bottom of the satchel, wrapped carefully in plastic, were dozens of hand-drawn sketches and detailed architectural plans. As Maria spread them across the largest table, in the diner, she realized with growing amazement that every single drawing was of her restaurant. The plans showed the diner from every angle, measured and detailed with the precision of a professional architect. But these weren't just drawings of how the place looked now. They were plans for how it could be transformed. Franklin had redesigned the entire space, showing how walls could be moved to create better flow, how the kitchen could be reorganized for efficiency, and how the dining area could be expanded to seat twice as many customers. One drawing showed the front of the building with large windows and an inviting entrance that would draw people in from the street. Another detailed a new kitchen layout that would allow one person to prepare food much faster and more efficiently. There were plans for a small stage area where local musicians could perform, ideas for outdoor seating that would take advantage of the space behind the building, and even suggestions for new menu items that would appeal to different types of customers. Every drawing was annotated with notes in Franklin's careful handwriting. This wall is not load-bearing and can be removed. New electrical needed here for additional equipment. Storage space could be tripled with these changes. The level of detail was incredible. He'd even included cost estimates for materials and labor, contact information for suppliers, and a timeline for completing each phase of renovation. At the very bottom of the pile was a single sheet of paper with a longer note written in Franklin's distinctive handwriting. As Maria read it, tears began to stream down her cheeks. "Dear Maria," it began, "you probably don't remember me, but I'm the man who came into your diner on a rainy Tuesday night. You fed me when I was hungry, and you did it with such grace that you reminded me why I used to love designing spaces where people could come together and feel welcome. I've been walking around your town for 3 days and I keep coming back to your restaurant. There's something special about the way you treat people, the care you put into your cooking, and the warmth that fills that little building. But I can also see that you're struggling, and I know what it's like to watch something precious slip away despite your best efforts. I used to be an architect. I spent 30 years designing buildings, but I never created anything as important as what you've built in that diner. The plans in this bag are my gift to you, a way to say thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists in the world. Your restaurant could be the heart of this community if people knew what treasures were hidden inside those walls. Sometimes all a place needs is someone to see its potential and the courage to make changes. I believe you have both. Use these plans if they help you. Ignore them if they don't. But please don't give up on your dream. The world needs more places like your diner and more people like you. With gratitude and respect, Franklin Morrison, Walter. Maria sat surrounded by architectural drawings, newspaper clippings, and the evidence of a man's entire life, feeling overwhelmed and honored and terrified all at once. Franklin had seen something in her diner that she'd been too close to notice, and he'd spent his final days creating a roadmap for saving it. She thought about his last words to her, about how the best things were sometimes hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right person to see their potential. Now she understood that he hadn't just been talking about the diner, he'd been talking about her. Maria spent the entire weekend studying Franklin's plans, spreading them across every table in the diner and trying to understand his vision. The more she looked at the drawings, the more excited and terrified she became. The renovation would transform her struggling restaurant into something completely different, something that could actually succeed. But there was one big problem. Even with Franklin's detailed cost estimates, the renovation would require at least $15,000, money she simply didn't have. She'd already borrowed against everything she owned, and her credit was shot from months of late payments. The plans were beautiful, but they might as well have been blueprints for building a castle on the moon. Monday morning brought an unexpected phone call that changed everything. A man with a deep voice introduced himself as Robert Chen, a contractor, from the next town over. "I heard about Franklin Morrison from Janet at the community center," he said. "Frank and I worked together back in the day before, Well, before everything fell apart for him, I understand he left you some plans for your restaurant. Maria's heart started beating faster. Yes, but I don't think I can afford to hire a contractor right now. Ma'am, Franklin Morrison was one of the best architects I ever worked with, and one of the finest men I ever knew. If he thought your place was worth saving, then it is. I'd like to come take a look at those plans if you don't mind. Robert arrived that afternoon in a pickup truck loaded with tools, accompanied by two younger men he introduced as his sons. He was a man in his 50s with calloused hands and kind eyes, and when he saw Franklin's drawings, he let out a low whistle. This is Frank's work, all right. Look at this detail, these measurements. Even after all these years, even after everything he went through, he was still thinking like the brilliant architect he always was. Robert studied the plans for nearly an hour, occasionally pointing out features to his sons. This isn't just a renovation. It's a complete reimagining of the space, and it would work too. But I can't afford, Maria began. Robert held up his hand. Frank saved my business once back when I was just getting started. He recommended me for a big job when nobody else would give me a chance. I never got to pay him back for that kindness. He folded the plans carefully and looked directly at Maria. Let me and my boys handle the construction work. You just worry about getting the materials. Maria felt tears spring to her eyes. I can't let you work for free, that's not right. It's not free, Robert said with a smile. It's paying back a debt I owed to a good man. Besides, my sons here need the practice, and this project will teach them more about quality construction than any other job we could take on. Word about the renovation spread quickly through Millfield, partly because Maria couldn't keep the story of Franklin's gift to herself. When she told Mrs. Peterson about it during her weekly coffee visit, Mrs. Peterson immediately called her daughter in the city. When she explained the situation to Tom during his daily breakfast, he mentioned it to his brother who owned a hardware store 2 towns over. By Wednesday, Maria's phone was ringing constantly. A lumber supplier who had worked with Franklin years. Ego offered materials at cost. The owner of a restaurant supply company heard the story on local radio and volunteered to provide the kitchen equipment. A group of teachers from the high school called to ask if their students could help with painting and cleanup as a community service project. The local newspaper picked up the story, running it under the headline, Architect's Final Gift Gives Diner New Life. The article included one of Franklin's old photographs alongside a picture of Maria standing in front of her restaurant. Within days, the story had been shared on social media hundreds of times, reaching people far beyond their small town. On Friday morning, a van pulled up outside the diner with Channel 8 News painted on the side. A reporter named Jennifer wanted to interview Maria about Franklin's story and the upcoming renovation. Maria had never been on television before, and she was nervous as she explained how a stranger's kindness had changed her life. What Franklin saw in this place, Maria told the camera, was what I'd forgotten to see myself. He reminded me that a restaurant isn't just about serving food. It's about creating a place where people want to come together. The news story aired that weekend and somehow found its way onto the internet, where it spread even further. By Monday, Maria had received calls from 3 different food magazines and an email from someone at a cooking show who wanted to feature the diner's story. But the most surprising call came from a woman named Patricia, who identified herself as Franklin's sister from Chicago. She'd seen the news story online and wanted to drive down to meet Maria and see the plans her brother had created. Patricia arrived Tuesday afternoon, an elegant woman in her 60s who looked like Franklin might have if his life had taken a different path. She brought with her a box of additional photographs and some of Franklin's old architectural awards. After the accident, Franklin became a different person, Patricia explained as they sat in the diner looking through the photographs. He blamed himself for what happened, even though it wasn't his fault. He started drinking, stopped returning phone calls, and eventually just disappeared. We hired private investigators, but it was like he'd vanished completely. She picked up one of his renovation drawings and studied it carefully. This is the first work of his I've seen in 8 years, and it's some of the best he ever did. You must have made quite an impression on him in the short time you knew each other. Patricia had more surprises in store. She'd brought along Franklin's old contact list, filled with suppliers, contractors, and craftspeople who had worked with him over the years. More importantly, she'd set up a memorial fund in Franklin's name specifically to help complete the diner renovation. Franklin had a life insurance policy that he never changed after the accident, she explained. Since he had no other family, the money came to me. I've been trying to figure out how to honor his memory, and this seems like exactly what he would have wanted. The fund provided the remaining money needed for materials and helped cover the cost of utilities during the renovation. But even more valuable were the connections Patricia shared. Suppliers who had worked with Franklin for decades offered their best materials and their expertise. Some even drove hours to deliver items personally, wanting to be part of the project that would honor their old friend's memory. The renovation began the following Monday with Robert and his sons carefully removing walls and updating the electrical system. High school students came by after classes to help with painting and cleaning. Local artists volunteered to create a mural on one wall, depicting the history of the town and featuring a small tribute to Franklin in one corner. Maria continued, serving food from a makeshift kitchen in the back room, though most of her regular customers understood that service would be limited during construction. Surprisingly, she found herself busier than ever, as curious visitors stopped by to see the renovation in progress and hear Franklin's story firsthand. Old Tom became an unofficial tour guide, explaining to visitors how the new layout would work and sharing his own memories of the diner's glory days. Mrs. Chen brought lunch for the construction crew every day, saying it was her way of contributing to the project. Even people who had never eaten at the diner before began stopping by to offer help, or just to see what all the excitement was about. 3 weeks into the renovation, as Maria watched Robert's sons installing new light fixtures according to Franklin's precise specifications, she realized that something magical was happening. Franklin's plans weren't just transforming her restaurant, they were bringing the entire community together in ways she'd never imagined possible. 6 months after that rainy Tuesday night when Walter first walked through her door, Maria stood in the middle of what had become the most popular restaurant in 3 counties. The transformation was so complete that she sometimes had to remind herself this was the same place where she'd once counted quarters to pay for groceries. The grand reopening had been scheduled for a quiet Saturday morning, but word had spread so far that people started arriving before dawn. Cars filled the parking lot and lined the street for 2 blocks in both directions. The local police had to help direct traffic, something that had never happened in Millfield's sleepy downtown before. The new diner looked exactly like Franklin's. Drawings had promised. Large windows let natural light flood the dining room, making the space feel twice as big as before. The kitchen ran like a machine, with Maria able to prepare orders faster than she'd ever imagined possible. The small stage in the corner hosted local musicians on weekends, and the community bulletin board was already covered with job postings, event announcements, and thank you notes from customers. But the most important change wasn't visible in the renovated space. It was the spirit that filled it. Every morning, Maria unlocked the doors knowing that she was opening more than just a restaurant. She was opening a place where neighbors met to solve problems, where teenagers came to study after school, where elderly residents gathered to share stories, and where traveling families stopped to experience genuine small-town hospitality. Though success had been immediate and overwhelming. On opening day, they'd served over 200 customers, more than Maria used to see in an entire month. The line stretched around the block, with people waiting patiently to try the food they'd heard so much about. Local news crews covered the event, interviewing customers who had driven from hours away just to be part of Franklin's story. Lisa, now in her first year of college thanks to a scholarship she'd earned and the money the diner was finally generating, came home every weekend to help during the busy periods. She'd learned to work the new computerized ordering system and had even suggested menu items that appealed to younger customers. Watching her daughter beam with pride as she told her college friends about their family's restaurant was worth more to Maria than any amount of money. The success had allowed Maria to hire 8 employees, bringing much-needed jobs to their small town. She'd been careful to choose people who understood that working at the diner meant being part of something bigger than just serving food. Every new employee learned Franklin's story and understood that kindness was just as important as efficiency. The most meaningful addition to the staff was David, a veteran who'd been struggling to find work since returning from overseas. He reminded Maria a little of Franklin, quiet, dignified, and carrying invisible burdens that showed in his eyes. She'd hired him as a cook after he'd mentioned during his interview that he'd learned to prepare large meals during his military service. What she hadn't expected was how naturally he took to the job, creating new variations on her grandmother's recipes that customers raved about. But perhaps the most important change Maria had made was the creation of the Franklin Morrison Memorial Fund, which ensured that no one would ever be turned away from the diner because they couldn't afford to pay. A simple sign by the register read, "If you're hungry, please eat. We'll figure out the rest later." The fund was supported by a percentage of the diner's profits and donations from customers who understood the importance of Franklin's final message. At least once a week, someone would come in who clearly needed a free meal. Sometimes it was a family traveling through town whose car had broken down. Sometimes it was an elderly person whose social security check hadn't arrived yet. Sometimes it was a teenager whose home situation wasn't providing regular meals. Maria and her staff had learned to handle these situations with the same grace Franklin had experienced that rainy night. No questions asked, no judgment given, just good food served with dignity. The wall where Franklin's architectural drawings hung had become an unofficial shrine to second chances and the power of kindness. Visitors often stopped to read the story printed on a simple plaque, and many left their own notes about times when a stranger's generosity had changed their lives. The collection of stories had grown so large that Maria had started keeping them in a special book, creating an ongoing record of how one act of compassion could inspire countless others. The local newspaper ran a 6-month follow-up story that caught the attention of a national magazine, which sent a photographer to capture the diner's transformation. The article, titled "How One Meal Changed Everything," brought even more visitors to Millfield. Tour buses began including the diner as a regular stop, and other small towns started calling to ask for advice on revitalizing their own downtown areas. But the recognition that meant the most to Maria came from an unexpected source. Patricia, Franklin's sister, had stayed in touch and visited regularly. On the 6-month anniversary of the renovation's completion, she brought with her a package that made Maria cry. Inside was one of Franklin's most prestigious architectural awards, a crystal sculpture he'd received early in his career for designing a community center in Chicago. Patricia had had the base re-engraved with new words, "Presented to Maria Rodriguez and the Millfield Community Diner in recognition of creating the kind of gathering place Franklin Morrison always dreamed of designing." Franklin spent 30 years trying to build spaces that would bring people together, Patricia explained as Maria held the award with trembling hands. "You did it without blueprints or engineering degrees. You did it with kindness, and that's the most important building material of all." The success had also brought some challenges Maria hadn't expected. Food bloggers and restaurant critics sometimes visited unannounced, and she'd had to learn to handle both praise and criticism from people who didn't understand that the diner's real success couldn't be measured in just food quality or service speed. There had been offers from investors who wanted to help her open additional locations, and even a reality television show that wanted to feature her story. But Maria had turned down most of these opportunities, understanding instinctively that the diner's magic came from its connection to one specific community and one specific story. Franklin's plans had been designed for this building, this town, these people. Trying to replicate it elsewhere would miss the point entirely.